Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the first of the Women's Studies and Religion program lectures for the year. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Joan Branham, and I'm the acting director this year, filling in for my good friend and colleague Ann Browdy, who is out on sabbatical. And we have an excellent set of scholars who are here this year and will be giving lectures throughout the entire fall and spring semester. I hope you'll be able to attend them. I also would like to just say right off the bat that we have this lecture co-sponsored by a student group, Nuestra Voz. Can you raise your hands, those of you involved in that? I just want to thank you for this beautiful adding meaning to the space. I'm a space person, so I just want to thank you for that addition to our space, and I know you have more things probably in the discussion time to share with us. Just a very, very brief overview of the program. I just want you to know that Women's Studies and Religion program, WSRP, was founded in 1973 to support interdisciplinary study of women and religion. And so each year there's a large competition with a number of people applying, and 5 scholars are chosen from around the world to come here and pursue their research to share it with you, as in today's forum, and it has moved from sort of the high-profile lecture thing to a much more work-in-progress type of format, and that's what we will be hearing today as well as the rest of the year. And also the research associates each teach one course during one of the semesters on the research that they are doing. I think that as you came in, you did get a poster that gives you the rest of the talk, so I just want to make sure that you've got that, and looking forward to our next one on November 1st. That will be with Sue Houchins, and she is a visiting Woodrow Wilson scholar from Bates College. She's not here today, but she, as you can see, is going to be talking about African narratives on slaves and women nuns. So that should be very, very interesting. I also just want to take a moment before introducing our guest speaker today to make sure you know who we are, because every face over in Women's Studies and Religion Program office is new this year. And I want you to first recognize, and so I'm going to ask people to wave, Liz Sutton, who is our program coordinator, and she runs the ship. And so if you have any questions about our programming, please do contact Liz. Also, I'm going to introduce just very briefly, if they could wave as well, the other research associates. I'd like for you to know their faces, so when you see them on campus, you know who they are, but they, of course, will be giving lectures themselves. So Ronit Irshai is from Bar-Ilan University, Miriam Segal from Indiana University, Michelle Molina from University of California, Irvine, and then, of course, we have our guest lecturer today. So I'm going to introduce her now. I'm very pleased to introduce Monica Maher. She's visiting assistant professor of social ethics at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, where she teaches courses in feminist religious social thought, sexual ethics, and interfaith studies, including Buddhist-Christian dialogue. She does it all. Over the last 2 decades, Monica has been working with women's groups in Latin America and the Caribbean as a consultant, program coordinator, and workshop facilitator, including for the United Nations International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women. Monica received her MDiv from Harvard Divinity School in 1998 and a PhD from Union Theological Seminary in 2004, where her dissertation focused on a Catholic feminist ethics of sexuality. Monica was then a Fulbright Century Scholar in 2004-05, and she participated in collaborative international research on the theme of Toward Equality, the Global Empowerment of Women. Today, she has entitled her talk, Faith and Feminicide in Latin America. Please welcome Monica Maher.
Well, thank you so much, Joan, and thank you all for being here today. It's wonderful to be with you. And I want to give a special heartfelt thanks to Nuestra Voz, the co-sponsor for today, especially to Seminary and Maria Cristina, who came, and Alana, who came at 9 this morning, busy setting up the space. So thank you. We wanted to create an environment today of celebration of women's lives in Latin America. And I begin with an image of a woman in Latin America, Wanda Peraza, who here is 21. She loved to dance flamenco, and she was killed last year in Honduras. So in honor of her life and in honor of Nelly Suazo, a good friend of mine who was killed, and many other women, thousands of women whose lives have been affected, we wanted to begin today with a moment of silence. Thank you. Words are daughters of life. Words are woven with our own skin. In narration is feeling, lived experience, the drowned cry, the tears that all of us drink, emotionality that fills us up, emotion that produces life in us. To narrate is to liberate, to take out that which through fear doesn't come out. To narrate is nudity, in which lives a mystery. Upon narrating, we prove that the experience of God is not the property of anyone, that there is not only one way to express God. To narrate is to unfold veils, to lift anchors, to set sail and slide away toward the open sea of time. We are companions of the sea. We feel the waves that rush. We carry with us the storm and the open heart. In the sea, it is impossible to hide the body, impossible to hide the soul. These words are a collective creation of a women's theological group in Mexico City, recorded by Guadalupe Cruz, a Mexican feminist theologian, who has used the term mystical rebellion to describe the emergence of women's spiritual activism, activist spirituality in the face of destruction and devastation in Mexico and Latin America. So it is in this spirit of mystical rebellion that I address faith and feminicide today. I want to preface my remarks with some general observations about women against violence globally. And this is based on the perspectives of activist scholar Charlotte Bunch about the challenges as well as the advances in confronting women against violence over the last decade and a half. As many of you may know, gender violence is now widely recognized as a public health issue, as a human rights issue. And in many countries around the world, there is now legislation which criminalizes at least domestic violence, and there are many grassroots groups who are addressing it. And yet, at the same time, with the rise in visibility and awareness about gender violence, it doesn't seem that there has been a corresponding decline in the actual incidence of violence. And although data is a problem, there is a lack of data. It appears that violence against women is actually increasing, and in fact it has appeared in new forms. And as a result, understandings of gender violence and the strategies to address it have been shifting. So that attention has expanded from a primary focus on domestic violence to include a focus on sexual trafficking and on rape as a weapon of war. Clearly, many of you may know this from current news stories. And all of these forms of gender violence point out the fact that it transcends traditional public-private dichotomies. And at the same time that the understandings of gender violence are shifting, so too the strategies to approach it. The interests have broadened from a focus on legislation and prosecution to address prevention and culture. And in fact, there's more and more attention now to identifying values and norms which underlie gender inequity and help sustain gender violence. At meetings of the 50th Commission session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women last year in New York, Dr. Yakin Ertuk quoted Dr. Martin Luther King saying, "Legislation can't change hearts, but it can restrain the heartless." She was quoting Dr. Martin Luther King here. And she added, "We want to change hearts as well." So she is emphasizing the need to engage in negotiations at the community level in order to address cultural arguments that justify violence against women. And indeed, UN documents over the last 15 years, such as the Declaration to Eliminate Violence Against Women and the Beijing Platform for Action, all actually stated that states could not renege on their obligations to eliminate violence against women on the basis of arguments which invoked religion, culture, and tradition. According to UN Fund for Population Activities Chief of the Culture, Gender, and Human Rights Division, Aisha Imam, human rights approaches need to move beyond the notion of culture, including religion, as a static barrier to human rights to recognize potential resources as well as obstacles. So there is an increasing affirmation of religion as an internally contested and shifting cultural terrain like any other, a site of conflict in which women are among many who struggle for increasing voice and authority. Activists and scholars have been articulating an approach to religion that recognizing its complexity and potential contribution to women's rights. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum, for example, emphasizes the diversity and dynamism within religious traditions, encouraging humanist feminists and political liberals to do the same as part of a more effective strategy. And indeed, as public health professor Wendy Chafkin asserts, the dichotomy between religion on the one hand and rights on the other is neither nuanced nor necessary, but reflects an essentialist stand that betrays both as fluid constructs. An either-or approach feeds into religious extremists' political purpose to lay claim as the sole voice to the fundamentals of religion. And in the face, indeed, of religious extremisms, women around the world are reclaiming their role as creative religious leaders, challenging prevailing theological constructs in order to affirm gender inequity and to transform gender violence. So scholarship examining this phenomenon offers insight into the imaginative flexibility of women's religious beliefs and practices in negotiating their moral agency in the face of multiple patriarchies. And it's within this context that I have become very interested in faith and feminicide in Latin America. So I want to first offer you a description and definition of the problem. Secondly, place this within a case study of the Mercy Weaver of Dreams program in Honduras, where I've worked for the last 15 years, and finally place that case study in the context of feminist theologizing throughout Latin America. So first, just a definition and description of the problem. One of the increasingly obvious manifestations of gender violence in the last 15 years has been feminicide, or the pandemic of woman killing. And many of you may know of it in association with Ciudad Juarez, where since 1994, the first decade after 94, more than 300 women were killed, and to date, more than 1,000 women killed and disappeared. And besides Ciudad Juarez, also Guatemala has received increasing attention. In Guatemala, since the year 2000, more than 2,000 women have been killed, so this is about 300 women per year. But not just Guatemala and Ciudad Juarez, but also throughout Latin America, there's been a rise in the murder of women in Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Argentina. Now, the term feminicide was first coined by Mexican parliamentarian and anthropologist Marcela Lagarde, and she modified the term femicide used by Canadians Jill Radford and Diana Russell as the misogynist killing of women by men in order to underscore its systemic character and to distinguish the crimes from homicide. For according to Lagarde, these crimes are more akin to genocide. That is, the objective is the total or partial destruction of certain groups of persons, in this case women. And this is all made possible, she says, by political, cultural, and legal structures which support the violence to help ensure the impunity of perpetrators. Lagarde points out that feminicide is a crime of the state, and she really emphasizes the silence, omission, negligence, and collusion of official authorities in charge of violence prevention and eradication. Now, feminicide, just to be clear, it does include domestic violence, so it's perpetrated by intimate partners and also strangers. It could be one murder, it could be a series, perpetrated by one person or by a group. And the point is that it is a hate crime against women, so the risk factor is gender. But not only is gender a risk factor, but so too are race, class, and age, because feminicide is most prevalent among women of color, young women, and women living in poverty. And in Canada, the term was most highly associated with the murder of Native American women. Now, these terms, feminicide and femicide, are highly contested among feminists and outside the feminist community, both as conceptual category and political strategy. So I wanted to point out what I see as 5 interrelated characteristics of feminicide. And clearly, in the context where feminicide is occurring, there is an increase in homicide generally. But these crimes stand out for several reasons. First, the degree of brutality of the murders. Women are often tortured before death through rape, sexual violence, stabbed, burned, and repeatedly. And after death, often dismembered and their bodies mutilated further. And secondly, then, even in the face of this kind of brutality, women are often blamed for their deaths, somehow named as guilty for their own murders. And this leads then to, thirdly, a fact that these murders often aren't taken seriously as real crimes or serious crimes. And then fourthly, then, there's a lack of serious investigation or attention, and certainly often no prosecution of the perpetrators and very little assistance to victims' families. And then fifthly, little documentation then and investigation, often very little media coverage, although the statistics we do have come from mostly from newspapers. And when there is broader media attention, it often is sensationalist and plays up the brutality of the crimes and provides graphic images, which really feeds into a sense of punishing women who are often blamed because of sexual or gender deviant behavior. Now, aside from the fact that femicide is debated as a conceptual category, I must say that it has been an effective term that has been used as a political strategy to really mobilize women at the local, national, and international levels. And it has occurred in a context of great social dislocation in Latin America. And in the face of the inability of states to respond, many Latin American democracies are facing a crisis of legitimacy in the inability to provide security for citizens. And all of this is exacerbated by a context of urbanization, immigration, forced prostitution, narco-trafficking, organized crime, and internal armed conflict, which in turn fuel feminicide. But again, in the face of state inaction, groups have mobilized, women's groups have mobilized. And in 2001, there was a campaign that began, you may have heard of it, called Por la vida de las mujeres ni una muerte más, for the life of women, not one more death. And it was organized out of ISIS International in Chile. Now, in addition, there's a broader umbrella of groups, many other human rights groups who came together last year to present at the Organization of American States a whole hearing on feminicide. And this was held at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So this was the first time. So clearly there's movement that's happening on the political and legal levels. My concern has been to explore feminicide from the perspective of religion and culture in the context of what I began with, this new interest in culture and religion to identify the underlying causes and the enabling conditions for gender violence. So I wanted to then just go to a case study, but to say then, I think it's really important to interrogate hegemonic religion because religious and cultural structures ground political and legal structures, often delineating the possibilities for the formulation and exercise of power and authority. So I've been asking in what ways Christian teachings and practices help to create the cultural conditions that sustain and support gender inequity and give rise to gender violence. But not only that, the ways that Christian teachings and practices can help to support a culture of gender equity and overall peace and well-being for women as well as all beings. And so to answer these questions, I've been working with grassroots women's groups and documenting their experiences and narratives. And so to this I now turn, focusing specifically on a group called the Mercy Weaver of Dreams program in Honduras. And I'll just share that I have myself worked in Honduras for many years, lived there for 5 years, including 1 year when I was a student here at Harvard Divinity School. I did a 1-year field placement in Honduras. So I'm continuing to build on that work. Now, the Mercy Weaver of Dreams program is a ministry of the Catholic Sisters and Associates of Mercy who have been in Honduras for over 50 years. And their general mission is to work, to act in solidarity with the poor, especially women and children, and to build a society where women can enjoy fullness of life, both in church and in society. So the aim is both social and ecclesial transformation. And the Mercy of Dreams program specifically arose in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch, which really devastated the North Coast in particular. More than 5,000 people were killed, many communities wiped out. So the Dream Movers program arose with an aim toward economic empowerment. But as they continued to work, they found that economic empowerment wasn't enough, that women really needed to learn how to dream, to unleash their imaginations, and to go beyond what they had been taught about who they were. And so Dreamweavers began to offer workshops in spiritual empowerment. And they today say that their objective is to create gender awareness and political and spiritual practices that aim to change the structures that sustain gender inequality. And to date, they've reached over 1,000 women of the northern industrial coast. And in 2003, Dreamweavers was a founding member of a group that is today addressing feminicide. It's called El Foro de Mujeres por la Vida, the Forum of Women for Life. They, in fact, were gathered yesterday on the 15th. They gather on the 15th of every month. They gathered in a vigil against feminicide. They played Gracias a la Vida, with which we began today as well, thanks to life. And so they knew also that they know that we're gathering today. Let's see. But they began in 2003, El Foro de Mujeres por la Vida. And interestingly, they organized around their solidarity with women in Iraq at the beginning of the U.S. bombing of Iraq. And after that, they began to recognize and talk about and organize around feminicide in their own region. And they were propelled by the brutal murder of one woman, Martha Moncada, who was 26, killed in Tegucigalpa in 2004. And she was killed by her U.S. Anglo husband, and she was dismembered by him and thrown into the river. And so on the basis of that murder and then others which were occurring at the same time, the women became very outraged and they decided they needed to do something. So they gathered in the main square in front of the cathedral and they began to celebrate life, to celebrate the life of these women, to show their faces, to name them, and to talk about it and to demand action. And in 2003-2004, there were about 300 women killed in Honduras. And the average age is young. It's only 26. And also, interestingly, although Martha Moncada was an example of an intimate partner death, close to 80% of the women are killed by non-family members and 70% are killed outside the home. So that these murders are lying largely outside the domestic violence legislation that feminists had really worked hard to pass, and it was finally passed in 97. And they say they never anticipated this increase in public violence against women. And they're sorry they didn't anticipate it, and they're really struggling now to know how to address this, and so to talk about gender violence in a broader way. Now, while the campaign Por la Vida de las Mujeres Ni Una Muerte Más is addressing the violence from the perspective of the political and legal realms, as I said, the Dreamweavers program is addressing it on that level as well as from the perspective of religion. And the coordinator of the program is herself a Honduran feminist theologian. She was trained in El Salvador at the UCA. And she says today that the deaths are called to transform oppressive beliefs, values, and norms into new ways of relating between genders, new forms of relating to our bodies, new forms of perceiving divine revelation from our embodiment. Carmen Manuela Del Cid describes a prevailing religious framework in Honduras as based in a deeply ingrained belief in the inferiority of women as an innate fact of nature. Belief in the guilt of women, a guilt that's passed from generation to generation that comes from Eve. She says we're blamed for men's failures, for social demise. And in fact, there is a sense of needing a social cleansing in Honduras. There's a great response to murders with a focus on psychotic individuals rather than structures. So Dreamweavers is approaching this from the perspective of religious ideologies. Del Cid says that feminicide is a crisis in Honduras of masculinity that itself reflects a crisis of a whole political, economic, and theological religious system sustained on the oppression of race, class, and sex. From her perspective, the murders carry a message for all women who are entering the new social spaces of work and organization, trying to convince women that the safest place is the home. A way of punishing all women who are in some way leaving behind what have been established as the divine order, legitimized as the will of God. She says that masculine domination and control are equated with the will of God. So in the face of such religious beliefs and practices, Dreamweavers is sponsoring workshops to create spaces in which women can come together and reflect on their own beliefs and question them and, raise their own questions, basically. And so I'll give you just one example of such a workshop called it was called Memorias Peligrosas Mujeres Poderosas, Dangerous Memories, Powerful Women. And in it, the participants looked at society's depictions of women and also depictions of women in the Bible through biblical interpretations, present-day interpretations. And they noted that Eve is said to be responsible for evil in the world, and that because of Eve, sin enters the world. Because of her, if you don't feel pain, you aren't a woman. And they began to question this depiction, noting Eve's strengths in the text. She was curious. She had desire for knowledge, struggled alone, gave birth alone, knew how to get ahead. She was decisive, free to choose. So participants began to approach the biblical text with new eyes of suspicion and a budding imagination based on their own experiences of both oppression and agency. As Del Cid asserts, we read the Bible in order to illuminate our lives. Now we need to do it in reverse. Read our life in order to illuminate the Bible. So women struggle to answer the question, what was Eve's sin? They concluded that though she is known for her sexuality and for tempting Adam, the sin of Eve is not a sexual sin, but one of knowledge. And they challenged whether it was fact a sin to want to know, and noted that the text tells the story in a patriarchal era, and it's a text passed down through patriarchal interpretations. So they emerged asserting women's right to want to know, like Eve, their right to think, to doubt, to have suspicions, to have inner power, and to act with that power. They spoke a lot about poder desde, poder, and in Spanish, poder means power and also to be able to. So it's a noun and a verb. It has a sense of agency and action. And discussion of socio-religious depictions of women not only included the discussion of Eve, but also of historical biblical figures of early Christian history, including Mary Magdalene. And by considering non-canonical sources, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, participants went beyond critiquing and reformulating familiar biblical texts to challenging the very definitions and limits of the Bible itself. They discussed Mary Magdalene as an apostle, a key leader in the early Christian community, who was recast as a prostitute and sexual sinner. And this had a profound impact on many women and challenged their views of themselves and of the church. They identified with the way that Mary Magdalene had been misrepresented in history, reporting that they too were unrecognized protagonists. They said, we've always had voz, presencia, participación. We've always had voice, presence, participation, but we have been erased. How many times have we been accused of something we are not? We have always been in history. And as Del Cid explained, memories tell us who we are, connect us to our power, to our history. And they link this directly to feminicide, saying that the women victims of feminicide are often called prostitutes, sexual sinners, and blamed for their crimes. And participants asserted then, as a result of their workshop, that they discovered themselves as inheritors of a great power that they have had from long ago but had not recognized. They said, for centuries we've been carrying a guilt that isn't ours. We have taken off the blindfold, and today we see with clarity. Today we have taken off the blindfold in order to set our powers free. For the first time, says Del Cid, women begin realizing that they belong to and support a religious structure that historically has marginalized them. The sustaining lies of a discriminatory and religious power begin to crumble. Women begin to see into the silence, omission, negligence, and collusion of religious teachings and practices in supporting gender inequity and gender violence. And they begin to tap and embrace their own collective wisdom and agency to respond. As Dreamweaver's credo asserts, when each woman discovers within herself the inner power capable of transforming the world, she runs to give the good news to her sisters. So this program of spiritual empowerment at Dreamweavers reflects a movement throughout Latin America, a movement of feminist theologizing. And I wanted to end putting this case study in the broader context of feminist theologizing in the continent. And I use the term theologizing to underscore its dynamic character. It is a process done in community for the purpose of social transformation, not solely an individual and academic endeavor. It comes from the community based in contemplative mystical experience. It engages theological reflection, and it goes back to the community for ongoing work and for social transformation. Now, clearly, Christian feminist scholars and activists have been, around the world, have been challenging patriarchal expressions of religion and Christianity for many decades and centuries, rethinking and rewriting theologies and ethics based on women's experiences and wisdom. And in Latin America, feminism emerged. It dates back to the early 1900s. So feminist theology in Latin America uses as its primary point of reference feminism in Latin America. And feminist theology itself emerged in the 1970s out of liberation theology, which emphasized the preferential option for the poor, a very strong Marxist analysis of economic injustice and neocolonial imperialism. And in these movements, many women had leadership and participated in base Christian communities. And yet, as they continued to participate, many began to notice that women's experiences and voices were omitted from the theological endeavor. And as Pilar Aquino, feminist theologian from Mexico, states, liberation theology has a fundamental lack: the absence of reflection on the historical and spiritual experiences of women and their efforts to transform the systems destroying their lives and humanity. So in contrast, feminist liberation theology of Latin America takes as its primary lens of interpretation the experiences of poor women struggling against patriarchal power relationships. Aquino and Mexican biblical scholar Elsa Thomas have outlined three general phases of feminist theology in Latin America. And very briefly, the first phase in the 70s, when women began to recognize that they had in fact been omitted from the theological endeavor, and they encouraged women's inclusion. And then in the 80s, women began to name more directly, in the early 80s, the double struggle that women faced, both against classism as well as sexism, and began to look at the historical figures in early Christian history of women in the Bible, and also the feminine face of God. So many people call this phase the feminization of theological concepts. And then into the third phase, which many say that we are still in the early 90s, there was a conference held in Rio de Janeiro, which was actually called Spirituality for Life, Women Against Violence. Women theologians from the continent gathered, and here they really recognized the need to do an interstructured analysis that include not just gender, sex, and class, but also race. And the affirmation was very strong of indigenous theologies and black feminist Latin American theologies. As well, at this time, there was an analysis of ecology. So often it's called an ecofeminist liberation theology, and eco meaning both economic analysis as well as ecological analysis. And Ivone Guevara is one of the most celebrated voices of this period and this ecofeminist theology. She herself was silenced by the Vatican in 1994 after she took a public stance for the decriminalization of abortion in Brazil. Out of her silencing, interestingly, she wrote another book, which was published afterwards, after the 2 years, called Out of the Depths: Women's Experience of Evil and Salvation. But she calls the current phase of Latin American feminist theology a critical or holistic phase, in which we're really looking at challenging the foundations of Christian theology itself. And Elsa Thomas states, we are aware of the radical nature of this challenge, which means reworking, or rather reinventing, the whole of Christian theology. Guevara recognizes the Bible as not only an inspiring force of liberation, but also principally a liberating, a legitimizing force for a series of oppressions. So she really calls for the transformation of symbols and stories that have helped to maintain women's subordination to men. And among these, like Dreamweavers has identified, is the fall story, Adam, Eve creation story in Genesis 2:3, which Guevara asserts to be the main myth supporting prejudice against women. According to Guevara, women bear in their flesh the scars of rejection of their bodies, of the guilty verdict pronounced by the patriarchal system which has formed them. So for her, discovery by women of their bodies as places of power, beauty, desire, and decision is a fundamental conquest for history. And in her work with many grassroots groups around the continent, she's worked closely with Conspirando, whose magazines I have up here on the table. And they have been a very integral group in both networking women around the continent and also furthering the ecofeminist reflection. Actually, when I was here as a Divinity student, I went to Chile for one of their courses and began to get to know them. So they state that really theoretical understanding is not enough about women's subordination, that the patterns of subordination are deeply embedded in personal and social psyches, so that one must look at archetypes and symbols in order to establish the cultural and psychological and social conditions necessary to facilitate peace. So Gabar describes this transformation that's occurring within Latin America as one that's unleashing women's theological creativity as well as political creativity. Women are embracing their agency to recreate the world. And they're speaking with courage about God without fear of getting it wrong. Indeed, women are daring to dream of God outside the confines of Genesis 2:3, outside the image of God as punishing and fear-inspiring, daring to speak of their own spirituality, and in challenging patriarchal expressions of religion, women begin to take interest in their own lives, come to believe in the power of God as residing within themselves, individually and collectively. A God who is the very motor in their work for the human rights of women, the very source of their political agency. Women come to believe in their power to transform a world of violence into a world of greater justice, compassion, and tenderness. In doing so, women name and reclaim their mystical experiences, return to what Gabar calls the unity of self, what Mexican theologian Guadalupe Cruz describes as an encounter with your own presence. As Cruz and her colleagues assert, God is in us. We want God to be with us so that we can live as if God did not exist. We want the courage not to flee from the world, not to flee from ourselves. It is a process filled with paradox and contradiction, a mystical process of rebellion, and a process moving forward. Feminists of faith around Latin America are increasingly responding to feminicide as a call to more concentrated work in this area of mysticism, of mystical activism, slowly replacing spiritualities of silence, sacrifice, and submission with ones of collective voice, social action, and women's empowerment. Indeed, as Dreamweaver's credo asserts, when each woman discovers within herself the inner power capable of transforming the world, she runs to give the good news to her sisters. Gracias.
We're going to move into the second phase, which, Monica, I'm going to let you go ahead and call on people as you would like. But I know that some of us have questions and some of us have things to share, too. So please.
So thank you. I wanted to say right away, thank the students in my class first. I just want to say the students in my class on Friday did this amazing presentation. And I really want to thank them. And also to say that Nuestra Voz will be sponsoring the community worship service here at the Divinity School on October 31st at noon, and I invite all of you to come. It will be in honor of women's lives who have been affected by feminicide, Ciudad Juarez, and Latin America. So please, we have many women here who are working on this, for whom this is their journey, this is their life. So I wanted to invite them first to offer comments if they had any, and to open up for discussion, because I know many people here have a lot of experience. Thank you.
And so privileged to have you as teacher, as mentor, as compañera, walking this journey with us. You have opened your heart, and you have opened ours to new ways of interpreting, expressing, and articulating ourselves and our experiences. I myself am from Chile, but have lived in many places in Latin America, and I do carry the hearts of the women and the voices and the stories of the families who still ask, ¿Dónde están? Where are they? And so I build altars as a way to provide a space, a sacred space, where the community can not only grieve together, but can replenish their energies and can begin to hope for a more just world, for a world with more love. I do have an invitation for everyone in the room and for your friends. You don't have to be from Latin America. You don't have to be identifying as Latino or Latina in order to join Nuestra Voz. Nuestra Voz is pluralistic, it's inclusive, and has always had members from various different cultural backgrounds, and that's what makes us rich and makes us feel strong, and that we can respond as a community here at Harvard Divinity School to issues affecting social justice. So consider becoming part of Nuestra Voz, even if it's just attending the events or come and participate in our meetings. Altar building is but one of the things we do. We also organize forums where we'd like to invite people from Latin America or living in the United States who are promoting Latina, mujerista theology, which I think is a void in our curriculum. And so this is an opportunity for us to really voice the concern and the need that we have as students, as scholars, for filling that gap, and we're so glad that you are here. But we know there are people in many places who are journeying in the academic settings so that the voices can be heard. Lastly, I do have a question, and this is a struggle for us Latina feminists, and it is the question of homophobia, both, of course, within the church, but as well within these community groups. When we want to offer our help and join with them in trying to figure out how to dismantle the institutions of oppression, time and time again, when we identify openly as Latina lesbians, the doors are closed and there is no more dialogue. And it's easier for the feministas in Latin America to speak with men and cross the gender barrier than to cross the sexual orientation and not recognize that our sexual orientation is a spiritual calling, is a component of our soul, of our being, it's our essence. That's very hard for a community activist like me, and it hurts more when you're rejected by your own people, by your sisters, by your compañeras. And I was wondering if in working in Latin America, you have encountered this issue and how are they dealing with it, particularly in Central America.
Thank you. That's a great question. First, I just want to say with the concept of feminicide, one of the critiques of feminicide as a conceptual category is that it can make invisible other oppressions. And I think because just saying women as a whole group is one group, it hides the diversity within that group, one of which is sexual orientation. So one of the things I've been concerned with in doing this work is to see how easily those whose murders, there are many people who are killed who are gay and lesbian, mainly they're called transsexuals or cross-dressers in Honduras, and when those men are killed, people just say, oh, well, he was gay. And explain it away, and there's not a sense of coalition across the movements. Now, I must say this is something that I thought about for a long time. In the early 90s, I went to the first Latin American feminist and Caribbean encounter that was held in Central America, that was held in Salvador. And at that time, the conference was discredited, the encuentro discredited by critics saying that it was a conference of lesbians, and so they closed it down and they had to move it to another hotel. And so some of the women there were saying, well, we're not lesbians. And then the women who came who were outly identifying as lesbians said, we are. And it was this huge, that was in the early 90s. And since then I know that there's a whole network of Latin American and Caribbean lesbian network. In Honduras itself, where I've been mainly working, I arrived a few years ago to see that there was a gay and lesbian church. It was a march, and I said, "Oh, that's fantastic!" And then they said, "Oh, this is against the rights of gays and lesbians." And the thing is that Honduras, anyway, had been pressured by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission because Honduras would not even give groups working on like HIV/AIDS who were outwardly organized by gay leaders, they would not give them the status of like an NGO. And so the Inter-American Commission pressured them, saying that was a human rights violation. And in response, a lot of the church groups protested, even to allow the legal right to organize. So it's an ongoing question. Now within the groups that I work with, the feminist groups like Mercy Weave Your Dreams program, has representation. They themselves don't have members. They work with other women's groups. And one of the groups they work with is called Mujeres Sin Límite, which is a group of lesbian women in the North Coast. And they have come, they're coming a lot to the workshops and speaking. It's not something that is part of, as I gave that outline of the Latin American feminist theology, that wasn't one of the points of analysis. And I think it's true in general. It's still kind of on the leading edge of what's happening. And it's really important to keep building the bridging, making the connections and building the coalitions. Because I must say that when there's a lot of times the feminist initiatives are pulled down and criticized and manipulated on the basis of sexual orientation. And I have to just share one thing. When I was in Honduras in the early 90s, we were told in the face of murders of some of our members that we weren't allowed to use the term gender anymore by the church. And at the time, the church said that gender meant that there were really 5 genders, including what they said. Let me see: a homosexual man, a heterosexual man, homosexual woman, heterosexual woman, and a bisexual. And because of that, we weren't allowed to use the word gender. So it's just to say that these issues are very intertwined. Thank you.
I have a question. When you mentioned you have these particular organizations that may involve women, I was curious what percentage of men may be involved, or obviously there's some men who are supportive as opposed to men being complicit in the oppression of women. What number of men are involved? Because when you talk about changing the whole culture, obviously you cannot exclude men from the equation. Yes. And I was just curious about those men who also see the benefit in women not being murdered, disappeared, and being treated honorably.
Thank you. That's a great question. And is Angelina here, or did she have to leave? Oh, okay. The question is about men and men's involvement. And again, first I'll just share a little bit about my own experience in the early 90s organizing women's groups and working with groups. Many of the women said precisely this: we need to work also with the men. And so we began to hold mixed groups in which we discussed gender and conditioning and ways to go beyond it. And we would break up into separate groups and then come together and lead sociodramas, and people loved it. I mean, it was really fun. And at the same time, one of the things that we saw was that as men began to change, they had a lot of pressure on them not to do it. And also women were criticized as men changed. Like as men took on responsibilities at home, people criticized the women saying, you're not doing all the work. Why are you making the husband do it? Or when sons were raised a different way, again, they were criticized for being gay. And a lot of times, again, it came back to this lot. The men were criticized for being gay. But So that's just at a small sort of case study level. On a broader level, there are a lot of groups now addressing masculinities and the construction of masculinities. Foundations are funding this. In Mexico, I know it's gone on for at least 10 years. MacArthur Foundation was funding groups. I visited in Michoacan. So there are groups of men who work together. They were calling it superando el machismo, overcoming male machismo, but what's in English though? Because I like to translate it because it's not just a Latino phenomenon. That's one of the things I really want to point out because one thing that could be easy to fall into, it's Latino men, XYZ, and that's why I thought it was important to say, yeah, I know, we're not doing that here, but it might be, one of the first murders was by this U.S. Anglo man. So, male chauvinism, perhaps we could say. So yes, there are groups addressing this. So both in scholarship as well as in activism. And I have some citations if I could talk to you afterwards. Yes, and there's students working on this as well who are in my class and then outside the class. And a young man was here who's working on that. He just left. But it's a really great question because certainly we need to approach this from many different perspectives. Thank you.
A couple of questions. One, I was wondering about the groups you're working with in Honduras or the Dreamweavers people. Are they all Catholic or what is the denomination makeup? I mean, are we crossing different Christian boundaries here? That was one question I had. And then the second question was, it's fascinating. We see this product of HDS and what she's done, and just how you came to this particular topic.
Thank you. So on the first question about Dreamweavers, it is sponsored by the Catholic Mercy Sisters and Associates. And at the same time, those who participate in the groups aren't just Catholic and they're not just Christian. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more in the groups is that women are more vocal about their other religious identities. And one thing that's striking to me is not only that they're, one could anticipate a diversity of religious belongings, but also that women are often belonging to more than one. So there's multiple religious belonging of an individual. And in fact, many women take leadership in more than one tradition. And what's different is that women are saying it now. We've had a priestess, Garifuna priestess, and also certainly the Mayan tradition in Honduras, very strong Mayan spirituality and practices. But it's not just the syncretism. It's that they're parallel and very strong communities, religious practices. So that's very much welcomed. And in fact, a lot of the interrogation of the hegemonic expressions come from outside the tradition, both outside of the canonical sources, like we mentioned, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but also looking to pre-Christian traditions and those traditions that have been demonized over the centuries and made illegal, but now are gaining strength with the strength of the indigenous movements more generally. And I want to say, too, Ivone Gabarra talks about the importance of religious biodiversity, which is an interesting term, really affirming the importance of feminist theology as an interreligious endeavor, and that this is important for the unity of all of us and for the cohesion and peace. We need to really celebrate that kind of diversity, not just celebrate, affirm it, and deepen it. So that's one hand. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I have worked in Honduras and lived there. I came to the Divinity School after having worked for 5 years in a rural community. And previous to that, I had lived and worked in Dominican Republic and Haiti. And I worked in Dominican Republic and Haiti more as a manager of different development programs, and then really wanted to work at the grassroots level, so lived in a village in the mountains in Honduras. And I was working with a community health promoter program. And this was a really exciting time to be there. It was through the 90s when the feminist movement was really gaining strength throughout the world, and women's issues were being identified as, violence against women as a public health issue. But what struck me in the work with women is that they more and more began to identify their own mental health as an important issue, and their own health as they were weighing their children for malnutrition. And that's important, but there was increasing violence, and as I had mentioned earlier, one of the women with whom I worked was killed, and she was killed by an intimate partner. It's standing up basically for her sister, the sister's partner was trying to kill her, and so what happened after that is that the men who killed them threatened to kill anyone who tried to find them and prosecute them, and so we did move forward on that case, but it was really difficult, and it made me aware of how difficult this was, and that really her death would have gone unrecognized and unreported. And we then had the first feminist encounter of Honduras was in her name, Nelly Suazo. And then we continued to work on that. But what's striking to me after that experience was how feminicide has continued. And it's gotten so much worse. And I go down to Honduras now, and there's so many deaths. So this has really propelled my own passion. And it's something I can't forget. And I feel like it's in my flesh, as Yvonne Guevara says. It's part of my process, spiritually as well as intellectually and politically. Thank you.
I was just wondering if you could speak something about connections between the maquilas. I'm sorry, the maquilas, and the connection between that and some feminicides that have occurred in Mexico and in Juarez.
That's a great point. Because Ciudad Juarez is a border town in Mexico that's known for the many maquilas. And in fact, in Honduras, where most of the feminicide is occurring is also the industrial north. It's a zone where there are many maquilas. And so many people have been trying to understand what this is. I know in Juarez, some of the women who were working in the maquilas were actually called, or they were I've heard that they were taken off the streets. They had been working previously as prostitutes, but what women said in the workshop that I was in Honduras, they said, and so what if they're prostitutes? Which clearly, of course, that doesn't mean you can kill them. Clearly, yes, this is a question. The links between economic globalization and murder of women. It is being documented that with economic globalization, there is more violence towards women, both domestic violence as well as public violence. One of the things people are saying in Honduras is that a lot of rural women come to the city for the first time. So there's this huge pool of women who are vulnerable. They don't have their social networks. They may not really speak Spanish because of the many indigenous languages. And so some of the feminists are saying this is a vulnerable pool of women. And in fact, there are many young women working in the maquilas, the age of which are the same age being targeted with femicide. It's unclear, the direct causal links, but the broader economic and social dislocations definitely fuel the crisis. Carmen Manuel del Cid, who's the coordinator of Dreamweavers, has done a really big study on the maquilas. She actually and has worked a lot on creating the respect for human rights in the maquilas. So what women that I work with in Honduras are saying is don't shut down the maquilas, but we need a situation in which our rights are respected as workers. A lot of women who are part of the forum are working on these broader economic questions on the ground. And there's a network it's the Central American Caribbean Network on Workers in the Maquilas. And there's a human rights lawyer who's actually a Mercy associate in Honduras who coordinates it. So they're women who are active looking at these questions in a broad way. So it's a great question, and it's one that's central to the whole movement. And I don't have any definite answers about it. I think that we're all trying to figure it out.
Hi, I just wanted to comment. My name is Divinity, and I am from the literally to see Juarez from my backyard. And being here today is very healing. pastors here, specifically because I come from a people that have ignored this issue. I remember being in Boston and being heartbroken what was going on in Juarez, and as a teenager being afraid to even, be out at night because of, this dark cloud of, murder essentially. And I remember, trying to speak out, like, why is this happening? And people in Paso and Juarez, my own hometown, blaming the deaths on the women. And I recall feeling, how can you just say they deserve to die? And I think right here it's important that we are talking about reworking feminista theology, Latina theology, because the root of the problem is people don't care. And these women are not been given a face or a name. They are left to the invisible, to be invisible in this globalized world. And for me, I think it's important to highlight the human rights aspect. And theology comes into importance here because there is something deeply embedded within my hometown that does want to ignore these deaths. And I too, when a friend of mine was murdered in March of '06, wanted to run away as far as I could. There's something that is almost like ignorance is bliss when it comes to this issue. And I just wanted to say that I'm thankful to be a part of this here today with all of you. And I hope that we could all, at this time of, debating on immigration and our relationship with Mexico, to see that we are sister countries. And as Gloria Bazua says, it is the first world living against the third, and it is leading. Thank you.
I think we'll just take maybe one more comment.
I already spoke.
Okay. Is there someone?
Thank you, Simile. I think that's a nice place to end, and I bring up the candle. It's Color de Esperanza, and Honduras, they always say green is the color of hope. So last time I was there, it was in the summer, they gave me a candle of the color green. So I'd like to end with a moment of silence and thank you all for your presence. And again, remind you that we have on October 31st, the noon worship service, where we'll continue to hold the spirits of the women whose lives have been affected with us. And I encourage you to take part in the events and activities of Nuestra Voz so we can move forward with our own political and religious agency.